Good afternoon. Welcome to the Gender Speaker live show and the fourth this month of my live streams about LGBT history. This being close to the end now of LGBT History Month in the United Kingdom. It's been a good month. It's been a very busy month. I had lots and lots of presentations for clients, and I've really enjoyed doing an enormous amount of extra research and really digging in to LGBT history. This month of this period now, the 21st century, we're looking for, which is really just the last 20 years, which doesn't seem an awful lot of time. But when I look back at it, of course, I've lived through this particular history. This is when I came out at the beginning of the 21st century, and I've lived these last 22 years experiencing what it's like to be a member of the LGBT community, experiencing discrimination and the good sides as well. Some of the great bits that I've enjoyed of the making of history, because it has been an incredible period of time with huge amounts of change that have taken place. And I want to look through some of that. So today's going to be a little bit about looking at the law, because we've had a big battle trying to take us through. But I'm going to start off by having a look at the changes that took place, where we started at the beginning of the 21st century. We didn't come into the 21st century with everything going for us, but it's clearly change was on the card. So let's just take a look at the slides here and just have a look at what was going on and what was really happening. I've just got my presentation in place so I can actually do it. So here we go. LGBT History Month, 21st century style. So these are some of the things that we came into the 21st century still hanging around, still the problem. The Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 was still in force. Gross indecency was still the main means by which gay men particularly were tackled by the courts, by behaving in a way that was considered to be unreasonable, considered to be gross indecency. And we had big cases like Oscar Wilde at the end of the 19th century, Alan Turing, who's now had a full public pardon, that was treated appallingly by the British government despite what he had given. And it was the act which was still there. Gay guys going cottaging, meeting up somewhere and having sex in a car in a public place. That was gross indecency. That was going to end up in court. That was going to end up probably on the sex offenders register for two people, basically, enjoying each other's company. So that was the first thing. We still had gross indecency hanging around, still a major cause of concern. We still had the consequences of the Corbett versus Corbett case, where April Ashley's marriage to Lord Arthur Corbett had been annulled. But in the judgment, Judge Ormerod had actually said, that's it, no one can change their sex. And we were still stuck with that. Trans people couldn't get married, couldn't be on their children's birth certificates, couldn't live their lives properly and fully because there was a piece of legislation saying, that's it, you were born a man, you stay a man, you were born a woman, you stay a woman. That was the law, and that had not been changed. It was still there 35 years later, 30 years later, hanging around. Section 28 was still on the books despite everything. We still had this horrible piece of legislation put on the books in 1988, which meant that schools could not educate anybody about LGBT issues. Local authorities weren't able to support minority groups that had an LGBTQ focus. So there was an enormous difficulty in getting help for particularly those people who were LGBT but came from, if you like, the more socially deprived areas of the country, or one of the ones in which I live now in Hull. So that was a huge problem. It had resulted in the formation of Stonewall, a charity to fight Section 28, fight for gay, lesbian and gay rights to get that changed. But because their focus was very heavily on dealing with lesbian, gay, bisexuals, trans people weren't being dealt with effectively, were not being represented, were being left out of debates and discussions in the 90s. And so Stephen Whittle, Christine Burns, Mark Rees, and others put together Press for Change as a campaigning charity to support the issues and interests of trans people. Subsequent, Press for Change is still there, still doing its work, but Stonewall has changed its direction and is now very much supportive of trans and non-binary rights. So things have changed in there. But at the time, when we're coming into the 21st century, Stonewall was very much an LGBT campaigning organization tackling the issue of Section 28. And we had a patchwork quilt of equalities law, and it really was an absolute mess because bits of law had been put together in isolation, separate from the other issues. So we weren't looking at equality and diversity as a whole. We were looking at the issue of race relations. So the Race Relations Act of 1965 created a commission for racial equality and a set of laws about discrimination and harassment of people on the basis of their race. And then in 1970, we brought the Equal Pay Act into place. It wasn't actually enforced until 1975. Along with the Sex Discrimination Act. So this was targeting the issue of women being treated unfairly within the workplace, women not being paid the same rate for the job that they did. And the big case that came up was prior to when 1968 had been the workers at Dagenham, Ford in Dagenham, where women were not being paid the rate for skilled work. They were being treated as unskilled labor when actually they were very skilled. So we had the Equal Opportunities Commission come into place to battle and fight for the rights of equality for women. And then in 1995, the Disability Discrimination Act had been put in place to tackle the rights of discrimination against people on the basis that they will be disabled. So I always give this example. Imagine that you're a black, disabled, lesbian woman and you are being discriminated against. How did you tackle that? Well, what a nightmare. If it was about being black, then it was the Race Relations Act. But if it was because she was disabled, then she'd have to go to the Disability Discrimination Act. If it was because she was a woman, then she'd need to go Discrimination Act. And if it was because she was lesbian, there was no protection whatsoever. She could not get protection because she was lesbian, because she could be fired. And nobody could really argue about it. There was no support and protection for anyone on the basis of LGBT rights. And each act was different. Each act had different rules, and you'd have to have multiple. It was an absolute mess. All of these various different things. There was no discrimination and no protection on the basis of age, no protection on the basis of religion. None of this. Over 100 other laws and statutory instruments existed around the whole area of equality and law. So a real mess that needed to be sorted out. And then, boom, 1997. New Labour came to power with a huge majority, which meant they really were going to be able to bring about some changes. And the first thing they did was they signed up to the Social Charter of the European Union. And that was the charter, that was the part of the European Union law, which was about social law, about the rights of workers, about part-time workers, about discrimination, about harassment, all of those kind of laws which Britain had steadfastly refused to accept under the Conservative government. Now immediately we were open up to them, and that brought about a huge raft of change. And when you look at what happened in the next 10 years after the Labour government came in, it is unbelievable. Look at this. Previously, there was more law changes took place in that 10 years than in the previous 100 in relation to LGBT law. It was an absolute fest of it. And of course, I joined this just as it was all happening. The first thing we got was the Human Rights Act to come in. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Sex discrimination, gender reassignment regulations. As a direct result of a European Court of Justice decision, regulations were changed in the Sex Discrimination Act to include trans women, so they could not be discriminated against, couldn't be fired for being trans. In the Sexual Offences Amendment Act brought the age of consent down to 16. That had been a long and very, very bitter battle, particularly within the House of Lords. Adoption of Children Act in 2002 meant that same-sex couples could adopt children. Previously, they had been barred from doing so. The Employment Equality Sexual Orientation Regulations in 2003 meant that you could not sack someone because they were lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And Local Government Act 2003 repealed Section 28. It has gone. And we'd expected that to happen an awful lot sooner. The Labour government came in promising to repeal that in 1997. It had taken them until 2000 to get the law into place, but the House of Lords constantly blocked it and stopped it, prevented it from going through until finally they found a way. The Sexual Offences Act of 2003. Finally, after over 400 years, buggery ceased to be a crime. And with it went gross indecency. They were just written off. That's it. They were gone. Off the statute books. There was no such crime as gross indecency. Sadly, there were still a lot of people around who'd been to prison, had it on their record and been charged. And it took still quite a lot longer before we actually pardoned everybody and got rid of their criminal records for what was no longer a crime. At the same time, the decriminalization of group gay sex or someone else being present in the building when gay sex took place, that all ceased to be crimes. In 2004, as a direct result of a European Court of Human Rights decision of Goodwin versus the UK, the Gender Recognition Act came into place that said, yes, you can change your gender and you can be recognized as male even if you were born female. You can be recognized as female even if you were born male. Finally, we could change our gender. Finally, we could get married. Finally, we could start to live normal lives without the hassle and harassment that had existed for 35 years before. Civil partnerships came into place. The battle for marriage still wasn't there, but at least gay couples could now create a formal relationship that was the equivalent of marriage, and they could now live their lives as a married couple. And then the Equality Act 2006 into place. So I'm going to look a little bit more in detail, just some of these things that happened in the early part of the 21st century. Human Rights Act, first big thing. Everything that drives all the equality law is the human rights. It's the Equality and Human Rights Commission. The Equality Act is about human rights. It's about a human rights agenda. And human rights is about treating people fairly. Now, more than anything else, human rights is about the way governments treat the people within their country. Unfortunately, up until 1998, if you had a beef, as Christine Goodwin had, over the fact that she was not allowed to get married because she was transgender, she, with a lot of help, a lot of funding, took the case to Strasbourg, to the European Court of Human Rights. Now, the European Convention on Human Rights was set up in the early 50s. As a direct result, at the end of the war, people looked at what had happened in Germany and said, this can't happen again. So all the nations got together through the United Nations and agreed a Charter of Human Rights, the International Convention on Human Rights, which set down basic human rights which could not be violated and gave the United Nations the power to intervene if a country was abusing its position and abusing those human rights. And we still battle with that now. It's not an easy thing to deal with, but we still do it. Now, Europe decided to have its own Convention on Human Rights. 48 countries signed up to it. It was led very much by Britain. Nothing to do with the European Union. This was completely separate. This was putting together a court where anyone in any European state, any of the 48 countries that had signed up to it, if they felt that their government, the local government, the national government, the police, whatever, any institution that's run by the government, if they were abusing the human rights of an individual, that individual could say, no, I'm going to take you to court, and you take the government to court to challenge what they're doing. And if the court says, no, that's wrong, then the country is required to change its laws and actually adjust its behavior. Doesn't always happen. Lots of battles over that. Lots of grey areas of debate over whether something is abuse of human rights. But almost all the LGBT law that's happened over the past 20 years has been as a direct result of a European Court of Human Rights decision, a European Court of Justice decision, that's the Court of the European Union, or a European Commission decision, that's the decision made by the basically the heads of state of all of the European Union countries. Now, Britain is now out of the European Union, so European Court of Justice, European Commission, we don't have to abide by those rules anymore. However, if we want to continue trading with the European Union, in many cases, the European Union says, if you don't actually have laws which we like in these areas, you can't trade with us. So we're actually in a position where, even though we're not required by membership to comply with those laws, we're required if we want to trade. So we trade, we have to comply. So I think everybody thought somehow, as a result of Brexit, we could wipe out all those European laws. No, we can't. If you want to trade with Europe, if you want to visit Europe, you have to comply with European law. So that's the way it is. The Human Rights Act meant that instead of having to take that decision all the way to Strasbourg and pay hundreds of thousands of pounds for a long, protracted case, and it would take years to get there, you could do it at a tribunal in your local county court. That's the difference. So all of a sudden, human rights law, the right to challenge the local authority, the government, the police, the NHS, anyone, any state body, your right is there to challenge their behavior in a local court and have a decision made that says, fine, that's wrong. Okay, it can be appealed and go up through the courts, and eventually it might even get back to the European Court of Human Rights. But the decisions made in courts are based on precedent, and that's really the important thing. Local courts can make decisions on human rights that means that you and I have the right to hold the government to account if they're behaving badly. If they don't like this, which is why the Conservative government would like to get rid of the Human Rights Act and go to something that's more controllable by them. I don't agree. I think we should have that right to challenge them. And we have other rights which people don't publicize very often, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about them, because that's one of the big changes on the 21st century, is that we now have the power to hold the government to account, to actually challenge their behavior. Now, let's just have a look at the Gender Recognition Act and a few of these things which came about, which have really, really changed things dramatically. The Gender Recognition Act means that I can, as a trans woman, I can now, as I did, complete a fairly bureaucratic and complex process and have my birth certificate changed. Now, as it happens, I was born in Malta, so my birth certificate is registered in Malta. And when I changed my birth certificate in 2006, Malta hadn't done anything. So they didn't really have any mechanism to enable my birth certificate change. Actually, Malta now has probably the best legislation of any in Europe. So I probably could go and change it, and will, but nobody's ever asked me. And you can change your passport and you can change your driving license just with a letter. And this is where we've had this silly battle, which I'm going to talk about as well today. In order to change gender, what you have to do is live for 2 years in your acquired gender and be able to prove it. And you've got to prove that by changing your bank details, change your passport, change your driving license, change anything which has your legal identity on it, so that people can see you're living in your acquired gender. There's no help. You have to figure out how to do this all by yourself. There's absolutely no help anywhere. There are a few odd little workshops that are run by some of the gender clinics, but in the main, you figure this out for yourself. And it's not easy. Because all the time you're being discriminated against, you're being hassled and harassed. It still goes on, unfortunately. You have to have 2 medical practitioners support the application. One of those has got to be a gender expert, gender specialist, who shows that you've been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. That's usually a psychiatrist who's made that definition. And a full medical report from the gender clinic, from your GP, showing exactly what medical procedures you have undergone, hormone treatment, surgery, etc. However, it is not necessary to have had any surgery at all in order to change your gender. This is one of the big arguments going on at the moment for why it should be changed. Why do I have to go through this whole rigmarole of getting often quite expensive medical reports to prove that I've changed my gender when I actually don't need to have had any medical treatment whatsoever in order to change my gender? There we go. I then got to swear a statutory declaration in court or before a commissioner for oaths, a declaration that says I am changing my gender and that is my intention is for that to remain the case until I die. So no reversal on this. It's I swear that this and it's a criminal offence to swear a statutory declaration that you don't believe me. You pay a gender recognition fee of £140. That's quite expensive. On top of, it can cost literally hundreds, maybe even thousands of pounds to get all the proofs together, all the documents, get the medical supports, everything else. If you're married, then you have to actually get the permission of your partner. They have a veto. They can actually say, no, I don't want you to change your gender. That's it. Don't care what you're doing, living, but I still want to be married to a man, still want to be married to a woman, and they can veto that change. The only way out then is to get a divorce. So that's a little bit difficult. All those papers are then sent off to a gender panel. There are 4 judges and 4 medical practitioners, and every single case, one judge, one medical practitioner will assess the case, and if they agree, not all do, quite a lot of gender applications are rejected and no reason is given, no details are given about the rejection. But a gender recognition certificate is issued saying that from now on, this person is to be treated as a man or as a woman in all cases, for all circumstances, and that's it. Birth certificate's changed, gender recognition certificate is available, and from then on, legally, you're treated in the new gender. As you can see, there are some challenges. It's a bit of a complex process, quite expensive. What's happened is only about 5,000 people have bothered. Out of the 20 or so thousand people who we know have undergone medical treatment or undergone some level of gender transition, it may be a lot more than that. We actually don't know because you don't have to tell anybody if you change your gender. It might change if you change your passport, change your driving license, that might get picked up. But in the main, we don't really know who has changed it because the figures there's no mechanism for tracking it and checking it. If you've popped up to Thailand and had a surgery and come back, well, who knows? If you change your passport, that'll get picked up there. But most people in the recent survey, which was done by the government, said it's just too complex, couldn't see the point. Nobody wants to see my birth certificate anyway. It does affect things like retirement. That's part of the reason why I did it, because it meant I could then, access female retirement ages, etc. But it actually has made virtually no difference at all because I'd already had my passport changed, my driving license changed in advance. That was some of the things I needed in order to show I had changed my legal identity. So once you have a gender recognition certificate, it is a criminal offence for anyone in an official capacity to disclose the information to any other person. So if, as a result of me dealing with the police or dealing with NHS, somebody was to tell someone who was not an official, that I was previously male and that now female, and that rebounded. And I've had cases where somebody did a report on something I was dealing with and referred to me as a trans woman. The fact they referred to me as a trans woman outed me as trans. Now, everybody knows I'm trans, so it doesn't really matter for me. But if I'd been, wanted to, I could have, challenged it. And I know one trans woman who challenged it when she didn't even have a gender recognition certificate, but the amount of fuss she kicked up, writing to her MP, the local council, the head of the local authority, oh my God, what a kickoff took there. The organization concerned, the housing association, said, oh, no, gosh, let's just, and they just basically retreated, changed everything, were very apologetic, and did everything they could to make sure everything's right. So the fact is, because there is a potential penalty, and you don't know, if you're dealing with a trans person in an organization, you will not know when they have a gender recognition certificate. It's not a requirement that anyone's told. It's a private, confidential certificate. So if your records in your organization show that somebody was male and has changed to female, if you disclose that information and then find out they got a gender recognition certificate, the member of staff who disclosed the information outside the organization could end up with a £5,000 fine and or 6 months imprisonment. That isn't going to do their long-term career any good. So really important, if you've got trans employees, all records before they transition, seal them. Only approved, authorized individuals should ever have access to that information. If the trans person wants to talk about it and tell other people, that's fine. But it's really important that you don't. Now, I'm going to go backwards and forwards a little bit through 20th century here, just in order to keep the content sort of contained around the single topic. And we're talking Gender Recognition Act. In 2015, now Labour government's gone, and this is the big problem we'll see later on. That change of government really did start to mess everything up. In 2015, the Conservative government decided they would have a review of the Gender Recognition Act, because there've been quite a few complaints that it wasn't working, it wasn't doing the job, people weren't bothering with it, and that it actually was preventing people from moving forward. So they did a review, and what they found was that a lot of countries, Ireland, Argentina, Malta, various other countries around Europe and the world, had moved away from the rather complex processes of, in some cases, requiring that somebody had to have surgery. That's still the case in quite a number of countries. But a lot of countries just moved to a point of saying, look, go and swear a statutory declaration that you're changing a gender. It's a permanent change, and then that'll do. We don't need all this complex stuff. We'll change your birth certificate and you can go on with your life. And it's not caused any problem. Ireland's had no problems with it. And, bear in mind, Ireland was originally, really opposed, one of the last countries to make that change, partly because they're a very strongly Catholic country. Malta, equally a Catholic country, had resisted the change, now gone ahead, and it's very, very practical. Same in Argentina. So that review started to take place, and then as a result of 2016 was the Brexit vote, and everything started to change. A degree of negative attitude started to grow, and it was as if this battle between Brexit had given people who had a different view permission to voice it. It was like you can say what you feel. So people who had a view about racism, about people immigrating and migrants coming to the UK, were allowed to talk about that. People who didn't like LGBT were allowed to talk about it. People who didn't like trans people. And we suddenly started to see a real campaign against trans women from one of the least expected sources, from within the LGBT community. All of a sudden, we had basically radical feminists, and very often lesbian feminists, that had all been around. When I did my master's degree, when I changed gender, the world stopped wanting to do business with me. And I thought, well, if they won't do business with me because I'm transgender, I used to work in financial services, in technology, and suddenly I couldn't get any work at all. And I thought, right, I need to become a specialist in gender and work it. Well, so much was taking place. I got involved in it, but I suddenly started to come across people I didn't expect to have a strong, negative view. Germaine Greer, well-known feminist, written some really awful stuff about trans women. One or two other feminist academics, lesbian feminist academics in America, written some awful stuff, which basically said, I refuse to accept that anyone can change their gender. You know, if you're born a man, that's it. You're always a man, and I don't want you in female spaces. And that anti-trans campaign started to go off. Now, I'm going to say also that there are activists on the trans side who have not done us any favors at all. They've just gone into battle, and we've got this war between extremist radical feminists, extreme trans people. It's about respect, isn't it? It's about, yeah, I want to get on with my life and work and just not have to bother about the fact that I was once man. Just get on with my life. And if I get abused, which happens to a lot of trans women, then I'm going to look for support. That's probably going to be at a women's centre because I'm abused as a woman in a relationship. And to ban me from that and say, no, you can't come here because you used to be a man, it is derogatory and it's wrong. And so we've got religious groups who've long had a problem against trans people. We've got far-right people who seem to have a massive issue with homosexuality, very homophobic, and we're seeing this in Russia and other far-right countries at the moment. Trans exclusionary radical feminists. Now, they don't like that term. They say it's a slur. It wasn't actually trans people who evolved the term. It started in America, where some of the radical feminist groups started to reject and refuse trans people coming in. And then also you've got parents of children who want to transition saying, no, this is wrong. They're being, they're being persuaded. They're being drawn into a cult. Oh, there is no trans cult. If you're dealing with trans, you're trans. And then there's some political issues because we're finding out some of the politicians, particularly conservative politicians, have generally opposed most LGBT issues. So this group have sort of come together in a united battle against a small minority group. We're 500,000 people at most. God. Anyway, the decision's been made. The review's closed. They've decided that what's in the act is what's in the act. They'll make it easier. They'll open a few more clinics. They'll cut the cost. But basically, we're stuck with the whole complex process of having to go through the whole medical hoops, even though the medical hoops aren't necessary. It isn't over. The battle is going to carry on. But at the moment, it's what's happening at the moment is that we had a huge shift, positive shift, and there's been a backlash. And now we're going slightly into reverse. Be interesting to see what happens. Channel 4 had a big debate, and this gives you some idea of the toxicity of this debate. This was the debate about gender and about the changes. Is all about literally the gender recognition review. There's Jermaine Greer there, trans women and other trans people, other gender feminists who are opposed to it. But then here's Kate Hopkins: a man who castrates his penis is not a woman, just as a cat with no legs is not a slug. Can you see how offensive this starts to become? Trannies, your families will never love you. You are living a lie and you know it. End your miserable existence. Commit suicide now. These are academics. These are people who are in the public eye, and those are the sorts of things they're quoting. This is Polly Parker, who really, really powerful thing. And, Piers Morgan hasn't been very good. It's a friend of mine, Piers Fox. God, name's going out of my head at the moment now. Fox Fisher, sorry, Fox, if you watch this. But Fox had a real issue just talking about being non-binary, and non-binary being neither male nor female. We're going to come to that again in a minute. And then we have this. So much pressure put on people. Transgender woman found dead in a cell in a Doncaster prison. That was one of 2 in that particular year. So it hasn't been a good time for trans people as a result of this battle. So let's go back now, 2005. We're talking about all these changes that took place in the early part. We got rid of Section 28. Thank God for that. Sue Sanders had been one of the campaigners helping to get rid of that. She'd been a lesbian teacher who desperately wanted to get rid of this so that we could get back to it. But of course, once Section 28 was removed, nothing was done. It wasn't like, oh, we've got rid of Section 28 now. No, nothing happened, nothing at all. There was no guidance and advice to schools on how to handle education about LGBT issues. They were just left to get on with it. Okay, it's no longer bad. You can go ahead with it. But they didn't know how to. A lot of schools were opposed because they said, look, the parents aren't very happy about this. We don't know how to deal with it. So Sue Saunders set up an organization called Schools Out, the purpose of which was to help schools to be able to educate about lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans issues. And in 2005 launched LGBT History Month. And here we are in 2022, and it's still going strong and still working strong every February. So that was Sue, who did a brilliant job on that. We also then had the formation from the Equality Act of 2006. The main purpose of the 2006 Equality Act was to set up the Equality and Human Rights Commission. This would replace the Race Relations Commission, the Equal Opportunities Commission, Disability Rights. Those would all be merged into one, and it would take on all the other characteristics, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But this was this big shift that now we had one commission to deal with it all, and they also were responsible for doing the research and the background work to help the Government Equalities Office put together the Equalities Act 2010, which would transform equalities in this country. So this is Trevor Phillips, and trans community got very active in because we read the initial report. Trans people weren't even mentioned at all in the initial report about what was going to be planned, the creation of a fairer Britain. So the trans community themselves got out and attended every single one of these consultation rows, so made sure our voices were heard. And a year later, trans was very much a part of it. And this was me. I'd just come out of university. I just got my master's degree, and suddenly everybody wanted trans people on their board. So I got very, very actively involved in being involved with this. And this was it, 2010. The Equality Act came about. And I was quite heavily involved in consultations and in working parties, working with the Equality and Human Rights Commission in helping to put together the background information on how this is going to be implemented. And we hit a problem. The Equality Act 2010 received royal assent in April 2010. On the same day, Gordon Brown announced that he was going to call a general election. And they lost. They lost that general election. And in May 2010, a government comprised of the Conservatives, because they didn't get a majority, nobody got a majority, a coalition government, Liberal Democrats and Conservatives came together. Now, I thought things were probably going to go okay, because I thought maybe the Liberal Democrats would be sufficiently strong to hold the Conservative Party back from some of the worst excesses. There was a desperate fear that they would just roll everything back and reverse everything. They had fought against the Equality Act pretty much all along the way. There was to have been, it was to have covered social discrimination on the basis of being from a socially deprived background. That got lost in order to get it through the royal assent. But here we have Labour Party's basic flagship legislation that had taken 10 years to pull together this. It had removed 114 separate pieces of legislation and brought about a completely transformed view of equalities. And it was handed to a Conservative government with the help of the Liberal Democrats to implement it. Not going to be a good story, was it? So let's have a look at it. The most important change in the Equality Act in terms of historical changes, up until now, equality had been dealt with by little silos. Race relations. The Jewish people had separate rules. The Sikhs had separate rules. There were separate rules for certain different disabilities. Blind people had separate rules. There was a whole bunch of different, 114 different bits of legislation, and every single one of them had to be dealt with separately. And then there was a whole mass of court cases behind each of those, with decisions made interpreting each of those laws. When you went to court, you had to look at precedents. It was an absolute nightmare. All that went. Suddenly we had a clean slate. We now had protected characteristics. It wasn't about individuals, it's about the characteristics. We all have age. Okay, and you can't discriminate on the basis of age. Well, actually, you can. We allow certain amount of discrimination. You can't have sex if you're under 16. You can't have you can't smoke if you're under 16. You can't go into a bar if you're under 18. There are a whole bunch of things you can't make decisions about most of your life, and if you're less than 18. So you have to retire at 65. No, actually, we can't afford that. No, 67. No, is that still? Anyway, the whole idea of retirement is steadily moving out of the way, isn't it? The point is, we can discriminate, but there are rules about it. And if you've been discriminated on the grounds of age, it's one set of rules, one unified code. Disability, gender reassignment, marriage, civil partnership, race, religion, and belief. Now, religion and belief means also lack of belief. You have a right to not believe in a God or to believe in a different God to somebody else's God. You don't have, it's not about a set of rules for the Church of England or a set of rules for Catholics or a set of rules for Muslims. It's a set of rules about how religious belief is treated within our secular society. Sex, which is about physical bodies and sexual orientation. So these are the basic protected characteristics, and that's important to remember. Gender reassignment is a bit of an odd one, isn't it? Because gender reassignment isn't really a characteristic; it's a process. In fact, it's a process clearly defined, as anyone who is planning to undergo is undergoing or has undergone a medically supervised process of gender reassignment. That was the original definition prior to 2010. So it's somebody who's actually going through a medically supervised process of gender change. What they did in the Act was to change the word medically supervised to personal. And that's a fundamental shift, because that meant cross-dressing on a regular basis was enough to demonstrate that you were undergoing or planning to undergo a process of gender reassignment. You were learning how to live in another gender. Going to see a counsellor because of gender confusion, being diagnosed as gender dysphoria. It wasn't necessary to go all the way to a psychiatrist. Just talking to a counsellor about gender confusion would be enough, and is enough, to demonstrate that you're planning to undergo, have undergone, or are undergoing a process of gender reassignment. So it's very easy definition for him to fit into. It doesn't have to do anything to do with a medical process. And in 2020, a court ruling said that gender reassignment also includes becoming non-binary or gender fluid, moving backwards and forwards. So it's very, very broad, and you'll see it's even more broad when we look at some of the other factors. There are different types of discrimination within the Equality Act. Direct discrimination. I went into a bar in around 2005. Somebody said, no, sorry, we don't serve trans people in here. I said, you've got drag queens performing here tonight. He said, yeah, drag queens we allow because they're performers, but we don't want, our customers find it very uncomfortable if you're in the toilets with them. And we were thrown out. And there was a court case around about the same time, a group of 5 trans women who had literally challenged it and had gone to court and lost the case because they had been banned from going into a bar because the barman didn't want them. It was 2008 before I could legally walk into any bar and know I couldn't be banned from there just because I was trans. But here we were, 2008. So that's direct discrimination. It's illegal in all forms. Indirect discrimination is different. Indirect discrimination is where you have some rules or regulations in place which inadvertently prevent someone from being delivered proper service. So, for example, the police used to have a height regulation. The height regulation for men and the height regulation for women was different because on average men are 2 or 3 inches taller than women. So they had reflected that in their rules. But of course, a trans man, someone's transitioned from female to male, is going to have an average height similar to other females. They might be taller, but often they're not. Often they're 5'2", 5'3". And they were being banned from joining the police force because they didn't meet the male height regulations. And that went to court, and somebody said, no, you can't do that. That's indirect discrimination. You've set up a rule about height, but it's actually working against people who are unlikely to meet that height restriction simply because of their gender. So you have to change it. So that rule got changed. So can you see that that's another massive aspect? Now, associated discrimination. These next two really important changes. They'd started to take place in courts, but they were in individual things, disability. And disability had happened. What had happened was a woman had taken her son to a daycare center. He had cerebral palsy, and it was quite severe. And so people were uncomfortable. They were uncomfortable because couldn't understand his voice. He dribbled a bit, and he was difficult to deal with. And often, his behavior became a little bit contrary. And so the manager tried to see if he could prevent him from coming, because other people were finding it uncomfortable. People saying, well, I can't bring my child here if that one's going to be here. And so we get this kind of negative nastiness that starts to go on. But he knew he couldn't, because to prevent the young child from coming would have been direct discrimination against someone with a disability. So what he did was to ban the child's mother. She had no protected characteristics. She was just she wasn't disabled. So it's before the Equality Act. And she took it to court. She said, this is not fair. You can't just ban me. My son can't go there unless I take him there. But by banning me, then that stops my son from going there. So the court looked and said, oh, this is crazy. You're banning the mother only because what you want to do is stop the child from going there. You can't do that. It's this, same as direct discrimination against the child, not having it. So the precedent of associated discrimination took place. So if I walk into a bar with someone, if I walk in with someone who's black and I'm discriminated against because I'm with someone who's black, I have the same rights as if I was black. That's it. It's not about being trans. I've now got the same rights because I'm being banned because I was with somebody who was black, banned because I was with somebody who's disabled, banned because I'm with someone who's gay. I immediately acquire their rights because somebody tried to ban me or tried to discriminate against me by association with someone who has those rights. And even if I was just heterosexual, normal person, I would still work. So that's really, really important. That's a big shift and a big change in the way we treat legislation. And the second one is perceived discrimination. And the story I always like to tell about this is about two guys in Cardiff who went out for a night out, and they decided to dress up because it was a Halloween. They dressed up as schoolgirls, and off they went down to town dressed as schoolgirls. And a bunch of louts decided that they were going to beat up the gays. They perceived them as gay or trans, didn't really matter, but they perceived that these guys were certainly genderqueer, certainly part of the LGBT community, and they decided they were going to go and beat them up. And then they went to give it a try. Now, the humorous part about this story is these two guys dressed in schoolgirls' outfits were actually in their normal working life cage fighters. So the bunch of louts that attacked them got an absolute pasting because they tried to do it. And there was no harm to them, quite a lot of harm to the guys who tried. The important bit here is because these people perceived them to be gay or trans or part of the LGBT community, so they were attacking them on the grounds that they were homosexual or gender reassignment, those two protected. It made what they did a hate crime. And it directly fell within the Equality Act because of perceived discrimination. So this is the important thing. I know women who've been badly treated because somebody thought they were trans, because they're quite masculine, they've got quite deep voice. Somebody perceived them as trans, treated them as if they're negatively because of that, and it was then held as perceived discrimination. The other ones here, positive action. You can't put an ad saying we want, I need a daily help cleaner. Only Scottish people can apply. You can't do that because that's discrimination. You can't say, only white people, only black people, only Muslims. You can't do that. It's direct discrimination. So how do you if you want to recruit a more diverse, staff, how do you do that without breaking the rules? Well, it's very simple. You use this positive action thing. So what you can do is you could say in your advertising, we're looking for new staff for this particular post. We would particularly welcome applications from members of the LGBT community, from the Muslim community, from disabled people with disabilities. By saying that, you flag it up. You can target your adverts into those communities so they're more likely to be seen. By saying that you particularly welcome those applications means that people who might think, oh, they won't touch me because I'm trans, because I'm Muslim, because I'm gay, whatever, will think, oh, I might give that a try. They sound very positive. When you have your shortlist, provided they all meet the qualifications and requirements for the job, you are allowed under the positive action rules to select on the basis of saying, we do need more gay people, more LGBT people. So we've got 3 candidates here. We're going to take the LGBT candidate because we want to increase our representation of that area. So it is positive action, but you can't discriminate against other people. You can simply use it as a criteria when making your final decision. Victimization is where, if I complain about being discriminated against, and as a result of that complaint, I am targeted by the people who basically were discriminating. And it's going to happen at work. I complain that somebody's sexually harassing me. They're called in and they're given a warning as a result of it. And if they subsequently come out and then have a go at me and try and target me because I reported them, that then becomes victimization, carries a heavier penalty. So what it means is, if I do make a claim for discrimination and the perpetrators attempt to basically try and change my view, try and prevent me from making a case, try and persuade me to withdraw my complaint, that's victimization. And that was even worse. Now let's look at harassment, because that's the big one that we all need to learn about. Harassment occurs when someone engages in unwanted behavior which is related to a relevant protected characteristic and which has the purpose or effect of violating a person's dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment for that person. Now, it's a pretty tough definition, this. My partner went to a college course some years ago. There was a gay tutor in the college, and there were a group of girls in the class, quite young girls in 17, 18, who did not like gay people. So they started making lots of jokes and comments about the tutor while he wasn't there. My partner was immediately alarmed. What if I were to come and pick her up? What if these people were to notice that they were with someone who was trans? I got a phone call. Don't pick me up. I don't want them to know, because if I don't know how they will treat, I don't want them to be talking about behind, but I don't want this problem. What had happened was that they had created an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment for my partner because of the way that they were acting. And that is harassment. So making jokes in the workplace about somebody who's Muslim, someone who's disabled, and I've heard this happening. There are one or two comedians and presenters now who have quite strong, who have cerebral palsy, struggle with their speech, difficult to understand. And I hear people making all sorts of negative comments. Well, what if somebody in the room has a child with cerebral palsy, parents, or a partner who has a disability? How will they feel when those sorts of comments happen around the water cooler? Do you see how easy it is to breach this rule? And this is where it's really important that you have to tackle it, have to stop it, prevent it from happening. The most common form of harassment for trans people is mispronouncing, misgendering. And in a survey in 2017, they found that 3 out of 5 people purposely misgender trans people. 3 out of 5, that's the majority. And that's really, really awful. Yeah, I use they, them as my pronouns now. I'm comfortable with she, her. I don't like he, him. I just, I let go of being male. 20 years ago, I identified as female because it was the only real other option that I had, either male or female. Now things are changing, as we'll see, about non-binary. And so things are getting a lot better, and it's worthwhile thinking about that. Pronouns, well, it's a good idea to, if you're on Zoom or if you're on LinkedIn or some of the other social platforms, if you go to a conference and your badge, put your pronouns on. She, her, hers, he, him. You don't have to change them, but it tells everybody I'm comfortable. Whatever pronouns you use, I'm happy. I'm happy to recognize and respect your pronouns. I respect you for who you are. It's not about making some political statements. It's just simply about saying, if you have different pronouns, I respect those. What if you're not male or female? And there's a growing number. Current estimates, between 250,000 people in the UK now identifying as non-binary. It's growing very fast. A lot of people who weren't previously identifying as trans in any way actually say, well, I never felt comfortable as the woman. I never felt comfortable as a man. I might be gay or I might be lesbian, but my gender didn't work, didn't fit. I didn't feel comfortable. And so now I'm identifying as non-binary, and we're seeing lots more. And Facebook went to town on this, and they decided, well, we'll have all these different labels. I don't think it's done us any favors, does it? And when you suddenly think, oh God, which one of those do you have? Intersex man, gender queer, cis male. And if you can't find one there, don't worry, there's plenty more. Polygender, pangender, transgender, T-woman, oh God. And there's more. My goodness, transsexual, man, woman, demi-man. Oh, good. And they've missed loads out. Drag queens aren't on the list, nor female impersonators, she-male, ladyboys, hydra, travesty, two spirits, Albanian sworn virgins are not. I'm joking. There are so many different cultures all over the world who recognize more genders than just male or female. And being forced into this tiny group of you're male, so these are the rules, you're female, so these are the rules. No, there's so many other rules, so many other ways to express ourselves without having to conform to a set of rules that says this is man, this is woman. This is the rubbish of the past 200 or 300 years we've been looking at over the past 3 or 4 weeks, of the way in which society has cajoled and pushed us into having to conform to a whole bunch of mostly unwritten rules about how we should perform, what jobs we have, what we're expected to do with our lives. And right now, more and more people are saying, no, enough. Had enough of that. No need for rules that separate us out. We're going to be ourselves. The problem with non-binary is that our language just doesn't cope with it. And English is actually the best language of all. I've been doing work in Europe, in Germany and France, and talking to some Romanians, and they say if they talk to their non-binary friends, they have to speak in English because they just can't communicate in Romanian in anything to do with not being male or female. I'm learning French again at the moment. And if I want to say I'm English and French, je suis anglais if I'm male, je suis anglaise if I'm female. There isn't a way in French for me to say I am French, but I'm neither male nor female. And it all becomes very, very complicated and difficult. Same, most languages are gendered. It's the sort of Latin base. So we got a whole bunch of pronouns which we use in the West, in English speaking. And people invented, Kate Bornstein came up with Z, Zim, Zir, and we got, peer. Oh, I'm not going to carry a card around with all the various different pronouns on, because this is just a selection. Most people, if they are non-binary, go for they, them, theirs. I know you say, no, that's plural. Yeah, that's when talking about groups. No, we use it all the time when talking about singular. Oh, someone's left their mobile phone. No, a person has left their mobile phone. We're using their. Would you give it to them when you see them? We use they, them pronouns when we don't know someone's gender. So now we're saying, I don't know what your gender is, so we use they, them pronouns. It's simple as that. I say it's simple. If you're used to saying she or he when talking about someone, it's going to be a challenge. I still get it wrong. And I identify as they, them, theirs. And I'm still getting it wrong when I talk about non-binary people. Practice. Ask people. find out what their pronouns are, and we'll all get it right. I briefly want to talk about the public sector equality duty. I know I'm going a bit long today, but the public sector equality duty is one of the most powerful pieces of legislation ever put in place. And I can tell you now, the Conservative government hate it. They hate it because when they tried to make some radical changes when they got back into power in 2010, they were challenged by the Foresight Society for not properly equality impact assessing some of their decisions. They hadn't looked at the impact it was going to have on various different people, the impact that some of their rules would have on women, the impact it would have on people who of color, the impact it would have on trans people, gay people, etc. So what the public sector equality duty says is that any public body, and a public body means paid for out of the public purse, okay? They get their income, their funding from tax revenues, or from lottery funding, or from charities, or whatever. But basically, it comes out of the public purse, and they have a duty to eliminate discrimination, harassment, and victimization. That's a duty to eliminate, not tackle it when it happens, stop it from happening in the first place. That's a very different approach. To advance equality of opportunity and to foster good relations. What do we mean by those? Right. Advance equality of opportunity includes minimize or remove disadvantages. So for example, I went to a meeting not long after this came into effect, and I looked around the room and I noticed there was not one single person. This is a community meeting, not one single person there from the BAME community, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic community. No Black people there, no Asian people there, no Chinese people there. And I knew that 10% of the population of Hull was from those communities, and yet they were not present at this really important meeting, from which involved the local Hull City Council and all of the local voluntary sector. I said, excuse me, there aren't any BAME people here. Why is that? And the answer I got was, well, we did invite them, but they just haven't come. Huh. The public sector equality duty says, no, you can't do that. It's just inviting them and they didn't come. You have to find out why. What is it stopping them? Have they come from a country where the local authority is actually the enemy? Are they struggling to come to terms with a democratic society which actually includes and embraces people? Is it very? I have another friend who worked with basically people who were prostitutes, sex workers. They had a gum clinic, a sex clinic. A clinic for anybody who might be suffering from sexually transmitted infections, but the prostitutes didn't come. Nobody wanted to come to the gum clinic. They didn't want to come because if they saw seen going in there, everybody immediately said, oh, they've got a sexual disease. That was going to end their business, so they didn't want to come anywhere near that. So what was happening is that there was a challenge that you couldn't reach them. So the only way to tackle it, go out to the streets, go out to the brothels, go out to the clubs and the nightclubs, give out chlamydia testing for kits in the toilets to people as they're coming in. Reach people where they are. Don't expect them to come to you. This is advanced equality of opportunity. It's about making sure that you meet differing needs, encourage participation in public life, actively seek out people from diverse communities to sit on your board, to be involved with your organization, and then foster good relations. Means that you tackle prejudice, particularly prejudice between different groups, promote understanding, and it's up to the public sector bodies to do that. So can you see, we can hold our local authorities, our governments, our police, NHS, everybody else, through the equality duty. If they're not working well, we can hold them to account through the Equality and Human Rights Commission, get them to act properly and recognize this. And they have to do this. They have to publish every 3 years what they're doing to make sure that they are complying with the duty. So we've had a big changes. 2015 for the trans community was the big shift. Caitlyn Jenner, big A-list celebrity, suddenly changes gender. That hit all the headlines. But the worst thing of all, suddenly Glamour magazine decided to give her Woman of the Year. That probably was one of the things, along with the review of the Gender Recognition Act, this really didn't help. I wish Glamour magazine hadn't done it. I wish Caitlyn Jenner had actually said, no, that is not going to work. It's going to fly in the face of everything. She'd only just changed gender. It was a mistake. But at the same time, we've got this massive growth in the numbers of trans people now out there, trans in the media, various different trans. I know these are mostly trans women or trans feminine out there as celebrities. We've got more and more actors. Now we've got actors playing trans parts. We've got also trans people playing trans parts and trans people playing cisgender parts. And cisgender, by the way, heterosexual, homosexual. We know the difference, don't we? If you're homosexual, it's same sex. Heterosexual, it's opposite sex. Transgender is transitioning from one gender to another. Gender identity, your gender identity at birth doesn't match the gender you feel comfortable with, so you transition. Cisgender is somebody who's comfortable with the gender at birth, and yes, same gender. And it's just simply enabled. Labels are there to help with communication, but sometimes they create battles. But there is an issue at the moment now. Should a straight person ever play a transgender part? Well, you know, Eddie Redmayne played Lily Elbe. Half the film was about being Ina, the man who then became Lily. And it was about the process of transition. I personally think he did a really good job, and I think it was right that he should have done it. There are other parts where, you know, that probably should only be played by trans people who really understand it. We shall see. Lots of trans men getting in the news now. You wouldn't probably believe that any of these people were born female, but they all were born with female bodies and now live as men. It also tells you just how powerful testosterone is, doesn't it? My God. But there we go. And we've got a lot of people now in between genders, androgyny. They're saying, I'm not really male, I'm not really female, or I'm both, or I move between the two. I'm expressing my gender in a way that maybe is different. And we have to learn to accept that. That's the big change that's happening in the 21st century, is the emergence of this middle ground, this place between genders as we become more and more there. Nice poster I mentioned before that you can get from the LGBT History Month site. Get this, put it up on the wall in your office. Really helpful, just to help people to see, spotlight the various different things that have happened over the past, 500 years in LGBT history, and as we move forward. 31st of March, we're coming out in March next week. It's Women's History Month next month. So I'm going to be carrying on doing these, doing weekly shows, I think. And I'm going to be focusing particularly on women's history. But end of the month, I will be looking at Transgender Day of Visibility. So I'll be putting together a presentation and a live stream about that when we get there. I've got quite a few clients also booking me for around that time. It is important, I think, that everybody, I know we're talking about history, but it is important that everybody starts to think about what they can do to make their organization more inclusive. Clear equalities policies, fairly enforced. It's all about fairness, and it's all about letting people know. Awareness and unconscious bias training, so that people understand the various different protected characteristics and can challenge their own biases about, do I tend to favor one particular characteristic over another? Do I have a problem? And it's not just about the ones that are covered by the Act. People are biased against people who are overweight or tall, etc. Encourage and fund LGBT Q support through the employee resource groups. Make sure your health and other benefits are inclusive, because sometimes they're not. Include LGBT people in issues and publications. Does your magazine clearly identify that you've actually got LGBTQ people within the organizations in positions of responsibility, and market directly at the LGBT community? Think about the publications that reach these communities and market directly into them. Trans and non-binary inclusion, a little bit different. Are people able to come out on the job? Transition. We have a different world now. In 20 years, the laws have all changed. What we have to do is change attitudes, and people want to be able to just be themselves. Create a memorandum of understanding, an agreement about what's going to happen if they're transitioning. How is that going to be taken place? How do you tackle different issues? How do you tackle the phone calls? How do you, what kind of uniforms they're going to wear? All these issues need to be dealt with. Trans and non-binary awareness training, support for health and welfare. Trans people in particular go through a lot of health issues. Confidentiality respect. If they don't want the information out, then sometimes you can't hide it, but don't publicize it. Don't make an issue out of it. And resolve issues like toilets and changing facilities quickly, and in agreement with everybody. I got called into a company once where 40 members of staff had signed a petition to stop a trans woman from using the changing facilities, and they just weren't dealing with the issue. So it was festering and growing into a huge problem. And active buddying. Encourage people to help and support and buddy trans, LGBT people, blind people, people who have got a strong protected characteristic. Get other people to help them, and that helps them to learn. And here's 7 basic things. See all LGBTQ identities as positive. LGBT education. Challenge transphobia, homophobia. Be openly inclusive. Listen and be supportive. Become a buddy and respect boundaries. So that's where we go. Final thing, there are all the time lots and lots of events. We've just gone through LGBT History Month, just about to finish. In June, it will be Pride Month. We've got Transgender Day of Visibility. Trans Awareness Week. It's the 13th and 19th of November. It also on the 18th is LGBT STEM Day. That's people involved in science, technology, engineering, technology. Those people, okay, this science, technology, engineering, and maths. So people involved in those areas, which are predominantly male, but there's a lot of women involved, a lot of trans people involved in those cases. That's another day to remember. All these different days, International Day Against Homophobia. I've been doing some work with the Ramblers, and they've got an interesting blog post about a walk which was organised to go around London looking at various different LGBT history sites. And it was just an interesting way to organise a walk that also educated people and encouraged it. There's all sorts of things that you can do to pick up Mental Health Awareness Week, all these things that enable you to raise awareness of issues that are affected by the equality agenda. And I'll just very quickly mention this at the end. We're moving out of this COVID world. We've had 2 years literally stuck. I mean, I barely left my house. I've done all my work from here. Trans non-binary people are 3 times more likely to be unemployed, 4 times if they're Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups. Significantly lower average incomes, 12% under 10,000. 64% have suffered domestic abuse. There's high levels of mental health issues in the trans community. About 88% have depression. Many of them have had elective surgery cancelled, and they're sitting on waiting lists for 5 years. Coming out and going back into the office when maybe they've been out at home. They haven't had to worry about what they wear, and they haven't had to watch their conversations so much apart from the odd Zoom calls. Suddenly they're being encouraged back into the office, back into the world where they were frightened to tell anybody that they were trans, frightened to show. Yeah, it's going to be a difficult time. Now is a time to really start showing that the office is a LGBTQ friendly place where you can bring your whole self to work. So treat everyone with dignity and respect. I hope you found this useful. I'm sorry I've gone on a little bit longer than my normal. It's normally been an hour. Next month it's going to be much shorter. Treat everyone with dignity and respect is the main thing, and that means everyone. I hope you found these useful. They're still on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and on YouTube, so you can go back and have a look at any. And if you'd like to give me a review on LinkedIn or just connect with me on LinkedIn, I'm more than happy for you to connect up with me on LinkedIn. There is only one Rick Arundel on LinkedIn, but you'll find me there. And I look forward to seeing you at some time in the future. Thank you for being here with me today. I hope you've enjoyed this show. Please let everybody else or all of your friends or whatever know about it. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. I shall be back next week with another show, but now we're going to be looking at women's history and some of the other issues around that. So thank you for being here. Take care.